General Rani is a work of historical fiction that draws readers deep into the hidden corridors of power in Pakistan, told through the unforgettable voice of Akleem Akhtar, once hailed as General Rani, the shadow queen of generals, presidents, and politicians. From her humble beginnings to the decadent nightclubs, she becomes the confidant and lover of General Yahya Khan. She bends ambition and desire to her will while silently shaping the fate of a nation. Through her eyes, the readers witness Ayub Khan's betrayals, Yahya's downfall, Bhutto's rise and passions, and the bloody dismemberment of East Pakistan. At once intimate and epic, the novel paints a haunting portrait of politics, lust, betrayal, and survival of a woman who reigned without a throne, manipulating power in smoke-filled rooms, even as her world crumbled. Lyrical, dramatic, and steeped in secrets, it is the story of one woman's intoxicating rise and inevitable fall, yet her whispers remain etched in the nation's history forever. The General's Rani is a novel written by Dr. Irfan Zafar. It is a work of historical fiction. The author is a Pakistani writer based in Canada. He is an acclaimed writer, academician, and social activist commentator whose works blend technical expertise with lyrical reflection on the human conditions. A King's College London alumni and author of Understanding Telecommunications, supply chain disruptions and impact on global inflation and living in the grave. His voice moves effortlessly between precision and the sensitivity of an author, crafting novels, essays, and columns that explore loneliness, peace, solitude, aging, love, and the quiet revolutions of everyday life. Copyright 2025, all rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, stored in a retrieval system, or transmitted in any form or by any means electronic, mechanical, photocopying, recording, or otherwise without the prior written permission of the publisher, except in the case of brief quotations embodied in critical articles or reviews. This is a work of historical fiction. Characters, places, and incidents are the product of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons' names, living or dead, events, or locales are entirely coincidental. First edition, 2025 publisher. Amazon, Kindle. For information about permissions, email to Irfan Zafar at msn.com. In a derelict corner of Lahore, behind decaying remnants of grandeur in an abandoned mansion, a household now reduced to only an elderly woman staring out from hole-riddled windows. Akleem Akhtar was her name, but the world used to know her as General Rani. She, who had once seen conquests bend at her nod, moved through the rooms of history now, but with a ghostly touch, silent as shades. Indeed, behind her weary eyes is the pain of a lifetime's worth of secrets, secrets that determined what became of an entire nation. As the sun sets over dust-filled space, Akim's mind conjures a past where power was something she held in her palm and men bowed to her will. Her mind wanders the corridors of her past, from a conservative Punjabi heartland to garish courts filled out by military dictators, through power struggles and the tragedy of a war that ripped apart loved ones on both sides, East and West Pakistan. And hanging over it all was the Hamudur Rahman Commission report, seeking to expose the truth that for decades she had buried under a mass of lies. As the nights went colder and she got sicker, Rani was left alone with her thoughts on some of the decisions she had taken in life. All that she had possessed of riches and dominion had long vanished, nor were the friends whom she cherished. Her children were all grown up, off on their own adventures, and she's sitting in this desolate place haunted by her past to deal with all the pain. Rani still refuses to be afraid, even if she is alone. She had played the game of power, and while she had lost in the final analysis, it was a life to which most could only aspire. She had been on a meteoric rise, her fall inevitable. But General Rani's legacy was not one of defeat, it was also a testimony to survival. She had beaten the odds, beat out tradition, and for a while she ruled the shadows of her nation. Tonight she would re-experience it all one final time. Akleem Akhtar was born in the peaceful village of Gujarat, steeped in tradition where life flew past at a stately pace. Rebellion she was not cut out for. As the rich landowner's eldest daughter, she only knew what one thing meant: to serve and obey and live her life according to somebody else, be it family, society, or husband. But Akleem had always felt the tug of something greater, something more dangerous. She was always an observant child. Nothing escaped her sharp eyes. She had seen the men in her family, her father and uncles passing judgment on people's lives. Their decisions were final and would not be questioned. It was during those first years that Akleem discovered what power is and who wields it when you are men with the sense of invincibility. At 15, Akleem had been married to a much older police officer. Her husband was a strict, old-fashioned man who thought it the duty of his wife to serve in silence. She played her role for years, giving him 6 children and running the household. But her mind, still keen, was now restless under the weight of this life. She had seen the world around, knew that on the other side of her home walls was a land of opportunity, freedom. One summer, the turning point was a family vacation in Murray. It was just another day, her husband trailing behind a few steps as he always did, his eyes roving about like the ones of someone who wouldn't let himself trust you. But then, as they walked along Mall Road, a gust of wind caught her burqa and blew it back enough to reveal her face. After so many years, she could feel the wind again on her skin and sun on her cheeks. And in that instant, something inside her broke. She stopped in her tracks. Her husband seemed bewildered and prodded her with his stick, a signal to carry on. But Akleem didn't do that and brought her hands to her face and ripped the burqa off. It fell fluttering down like a cast-off veil of tyranny. Her husband's eyes widened in terror, but Akleem did not pause. She threw the remainder of her abaya to one side, watched it fall into the sand. "You put it on," she said, with a calm anger that has been decades in the making. "I am done." She left her husband that same night, with the children in tow. She moved back in with her family, but they didn't accept this independence. Their support gone, she had to raise 6 children on her own, a woman alone in a man's world that wasn't built for women like her. Lahore's and Rawalpindi's nightclubs in the 70s were worlds of their own, wrapped with cigarette smoke and faint amber light as crystal clinks punctuated murmurs. The rich and powerful used to assemble in these sumptuous rooms, resplendent in well-cut suits and their eyes aglow with ambition and wants. Expensive cigars, heavy perfume, and the women wafted through as shadows. Behind these private clubs, the rich and powerful of Pakistan met to drink, dance, perhaps even finding love for a night. Akleem began to visit these social clubs. In these vainglorious halls of men of power, ambition and spirited, she saw her chance. From what she had gleaned over the years watching her husband and his cronies, men in power possessed certain needs, ones that could be fulfilled by a woman who knew how to work around the system. She had learned the secret throb of men, including the 1,000 small cuts of a patriarchal society that devalues women's desires and ambitions. Their wants, however, shrouded in the trappings of power and ambition, were often commonplace, yet edged with primal craving, whispers for desire that slipped into the silences between their public lives and private yearnings. These men who commanded armies, whose policies were dictated by them, and upon whom whole nations had been coerced into closing rank, felt within themselves an unspeakable hunger for something they could not take. They did not loathe for material wealth as riches were piled around them like sweeping leaves of gold, and they spent it with an abandon. No, their hunger was more profound and cryptic. They tried, in brief flashes of time, to flee from the weighty responsibilities that came with their thrones, to feel, if only for a single night, the addictive tugs toward surrender and being seen by someone who did not fear them. They required a caress that was not the result of duty, but desire, and a glance which cut through their mask worn by day. And so she, the obedient wife of a police officer, became Rani, the queen who exercised those needs for power, recognition, fame, and money. She first met General Yahya Khan when he was already an influential man. It was at a party in Rawalpindi, the kind to which all those military officers and politicians and business tycoons are invited, where everyone laughed too hard and clinked their glasses together ferociously. That night, Yahya was in his true spirit. His broad frame surged through the laughing noise as bottle after glass of whiskey went down his deep-voiced throat. She took an eagle eye on him, looking for the right time to catch her prey. It was when Yahya had gotten up and stepped towards the bathroom, she strategically stood close by, not to be missed by his liquidated eyes. When his face crossed hers, they locked eyes and time stopped for a moment. Yahya, being Yahya, gave her a smile and introduced himself. "Akleem Akhtar," she said, cool and confident. But you can call me Rani. Yahya raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Rani, you say? A nice name for a woman of your demeanor. From the instant their worlds crashed into each other, Akleem and Yahya were connected by invisible thread that was spun not out of lust alone, but from a shared recognition concerning power. She called him Aghajani, a name that spoke of intimacy, trust, and something else neither could identify. To the world, he was the president, a looming military figure in his regalia. In the smoke-filled rooms where whispers dared not go, Yahya was a man, and she, the woman who knew him best. It was not just something temporary with them, but rather a meeting of mutual need. Yahya had been surrounded by flatterers and adversaries, but he encountered something rare in her, a woman who did not address him with forelock-tugging dread or reverence-laden submission. She was his confidante, the person whom he relied on in moments of hesitation and despair. She had been an escape from the overwhelming weight of his, a cocoon where he could strip away the mask and be himself. For her, it was not simply influence but a form of mastery, the certainty that she held sway over a man who commanded armies and governed the nation. But it wasn't just manipulation or seduction. She knew who he was beyond a uniform, what his vulnerabilities were that he didn't want the world to see. She knew how to lead him, to cool his impulses, and still flatter his vanity without losing her sense of self. Their relationship was a delicate balance of power and submission, with neither ever quite gaining the upper hand, but playing their parts beautifully. The two of them governed a nation not with decrees and announcements, but through the hushed conversations in private chambers. The words of advice from her empowered him to take decisions that determined the country and its future, his deeds carrying the faint shadow of her directives. And while there was a great deal of guessing, not many knew the extent of their bond. It was a love affair swathed in the discourse of politics, where passion and power played out so seamlessly that it grew impossible to discern one from the other. But in the quiet moments, when other lovers vanished and it was just them alone together, there were things that couldn't be explained. In his armor off, he would look at her with a softness never seen elsewhere. And she, who had spent an entire lifetime demanding control over herself and others, would allow herself to soften a little, just for a moment or two, in the warmth of his arms. For a while, together they wielded immense power. Their union was founded on something far more tenuous, an unspoken understanding that in each other's arms lay what neither could find alone. Being a sharp woman, she knew she wasn't the only one spinning around him. So she played the role of alluring woman for him without any feeling of jealousy, guilt, or emotional attachment. The melodious queen Noor Jahan floated in his life, and her voice captivated his heart like a velvet rope. Her songs warmed his nights in a way that nothing else could. She was more than a singer, something beyond. She was art come alive, transient beauty that he could never truly own but which he consumed as best he could. And then there was Tarana, the movie actress, who came and went to his house regularly. She, like the others, knew why it was tempting to be close to power's center. Her laughter, her beauty filled the place where certain war and state decisions paused upon them for a second. Her allure and beauty mesmerized him, and he would enjoy their love-making, a brief retreat from his responsibilities as monarch. They would collide in moments of desire that were as urgent and slow-burning, sustained by the ever-present fog of alcohol. But those were not the only women who intersected his world. There were countless others, too, whose names would be lost in history, but to whom there was that same thickness of secrecy and air. They came not only as beautiful women, but also works of beauty that were empowered by a man whose excesses had become synonymous with the decadence and degeneracy of a country in decline. They were as insubstantial as shadows, their lives mere threads in the tapestry of an infatuated leader and a nation close to collapse. In darkened chambers, he lounged like a king in exile, with women whose attachments were as fleeting as the authority he had once wielded. As the world beyond his doors came crashing down, inside just an arm's reach, everything played on. The music, dance of desire with each woman participating in an unfolding tragedy pushing forward to its inexorable finish. But there was more to these nights of passion and desire, which was haunting Rani as she sat alone in her isolated, dilapidated home. It was the fragments of nation becoming to fall further apart. A solitary lamp shone in the officer's mess, casting bars of night across General Yahya's face. His glass was half full, with the ice long gone, She sat in his office sipping her drink while Yahya's staff had left. Have you ever thought about what may happen to a country? She spoke while looking at him. He gave a slow, tired smile. Rani, you always come up with a question that tastes like a confession. Because I have lived long enough to watch truth and lies having identical face and have witnessed a dream stolen from people, not to mention the way they got rid of Quaid. Can you just imagine the ambulance taking the poor guy to Karachi for treatment, running out of fuel and breaking down, while the ones behind all this orchestrated scheme were partying at the French embassy while he was breathing his last? But anyway, you certainly owe a lot to Ayub Khan for first getting rid of Quaid's sister and then finally giving you reins of power. Fatima Jinnah. Yahya's eyes slid away, not in surprise, but as if a forgotten past has hit him. Ayub feared no one, but he was fearful of Quaid. But you are right, Rani, in the end he destroyed Quaid's dream. I was not part of that game. Well, Aghajani, you are now even afraid of Quaid's sister's shadow. It is the only shadow bigger than yours. She smiled at him. He swished the liquid around in his glass, making the amber spin. Silencing her was necessary for Ayub. That is the least he could do. Fatima's name was spoken like a prayer. But the field marshal announced his win shamelessly. His triumph was a hollow one that eventually gave way to putrefaction. You know Yahya, she died abruptly. Just 2 days prior she was spotted laughing at a wedding. Then nothing, no goodbyes, not to mention the wounds on her body, the blood that had not dried. Her garments snapped at the seams, confirming it as the ones who saw her first attested. Yet the evidence is worthless, isn't it? She looked at Yahya. What really happened? Rani, some truths are heavier. That's not an answer to my question. That is the only answer I can provide. He got up to fill another glass of whiskey. They sat in silence. Outside, a wind slammed the windows, and Ayub, your master. She looked at him, expecting a reply. The idiot thought of him as unshakable. Yahya grinned. You can rig the vote, Yahya, but you can't erase history. And then she remembered Dog on Leash being spit on by the angry crowd with Ayub's name written on it. Embedded in that scene was a message for the dictator. Any general who is living under an illusion of being invincible and capable of pushing people into silence was a miserably delusional scum. Ayub could not take it, walking away into oblivion. Rani sat in the darkness of her room, with scattered papers of commission report laid out on the table. The pages, heavy with history, felt like they were pulling her back into the memories and madness of 1971. As she followed the words with her eyes, her thoughts roamed back to those days when a nation hovered on the brink of disaster. Pakistan and India were not just fighting a war for borders, they were breaking dreams, including her own. The country was also a divided land. East and West were two halves separated by geography and culture. The voices from Bengal were shouting for autonomy, equality, and recognition. But the West, isolated in its distant halls of power, turned deaf to those cries. She could hear the echoes of those demands, unmet, as the gap between both halves widened. She had followed the election, which was designed to bring people together, but in fact it cut them all apart. Sheikh Mujibur Rahman's Awami League had won in the east, yet power was still firmly held by Zulfikar Ali Bhutto and his supporters in the west. What ensued was a ruthless crackdown called Operation Searchlight, a military operation carried out in an effort to curb the Bengali nationalist movement. She recalled the dark whispers in the halls of power, and its men so arrogant that they thought guns and fire would be enough to silence an entire people. They were wrong, of course. The East could not be stifled, and resistance blazed like a fire across the ravaged landscape. Her eyes glanced over the name of General Yahya Khan, the butcher of Dhaka. His brutality had only compounded the killing. And General Niazi, a man of cruelty and recklessness, who'd once glorified in being called Tiger Niazi. And his words reverberated in her mind, crying out for retribution. I will turn East Pakistan into a slaughterhouse, and kill 1 million of them, and the rest will eat out of our hands. The shamelessness did not stop there. While addressing his officers on the reports of sexual assault on women, he advised his soldiers in the most pathetic way. For goodness sake, it is an enemy territory. Why don't you use FL, French letter, condoms? The Bengal rivers ran red. The people bled for their freedom. The pages of the report chronicled that descent into anarchy. The fall of Dhaka, when warplanes clouded the skis and the ground shook under boots. Yahya Khan, swimming in his power dreams, womanizing and spending his nights drenched in liquor, had little notion of the serious situation. How detached he had become in the arms of caressing women. Nations, they say, do not die with a bang but slowly move towards destruction. She saw it all happen where, not as a soldier, but as a woman once too close to the halls of power and the whispers that gently built and shattered empires. It was astonishing but not unexpected. A news item, replete with disbelief, a name she recognized, had signed the surrender in Dhaka and placed his pen against history to engrave our disgrace. Sitting next to Niazi was General Jagjit Singh Arora, poised and methodical, not a victor hungry for victory, but a man who answered to history. This was not signaled by the sounds of gunshots, but actually by the silence. Not the honor guard, not the trumpet, just the table and that goddamned stone heavier than any gun. And Niazi, boisterous and swaggering no more, lowered his head not in surrender, but under the combined tons of 93,000 soldiers whose surrender he now signed away. His shoulders slumped under weight only a general should bear, but a weight not earned solely on the battlefield, yet something weighed down and burdened upon from men of power elsewhere far from the mud and blood of the East. At that instant, she felt not the vibration of a nation studied through headlines, but in her heart. One who sat amongst the great, their pride steeped in vanity, now witnessing the myth of Pakistan shattered. A reminder of the eastern half of the green flag maybe, its colors torn up and repainted in reds and greens, the scar visible. The surrender was easy. What taunted her was the silence that followed. No apology, no reckoning, only smoke-filled chambers where the last of the generals drank to oblivion, concocted falsehoods, bemoaning their own disgrace. And then there were women who paid a silent price of this war. I gazed at my reflection, no longer able to spot the woman who once sipped whiskey with decision-makers. A wrathful mourner in silk, lamenting a requiem for a nation that dreamt unity amidst the absence of justice, pride amidst destitution. On the December 16th, under a distant star, Pakistan lost more than just its eastern province. That day it gave away a piece of its soul. The capitulation wasn't just a matter of military defeat, it was the crumpling up of an entire dream. She could almost feel the weight of it again, Bangladesh-born and East Pakistan lost sliding through the fingers of those who used to consider themselves invincible. Her eyes focused on the soldiers taken prisoner of war. Those men, marooned in captivity while the generals partied up a storm in their bunkers, drinking to excess. She was all too familiar with the excess that had blinded leadership. Those in power let the nation bleed to satisfy their own pleasures. Z.A. Bhutto, who had assumed the presidency in December 1971, and then went on to become the prime minister later in 1973, himself appointed this commission, but did not come out unscathed, and neither were the shenanigans of his cronies in power. As she read about the corruption, the betrayals and the generals living in luxury, enjoying themselves while their country fell apart around them, Rani sighed a little. Her Agha Jani's excesses were in black and white, his indulgences, his women including her, the decline of a leader turned into an empty shell. Her name also haunted the margins of those pages. It had always been there in whispers and shadows. They talked about her influence, her manipulation. The men in power had failed to see their own doom, and her hands had been on the strings. But the guilt still haunted her, like a constant shadow she could never quite walk away. She had seen too much, learned too many secrets. She left the papers scattered and pondered once again how transient power could be. Yahya had fallen. Bhutto had taken his place. Now it was the country's generals who had once wielded an iron grip on power were disgraced. In the end, it wasn't just the men who had written its tragedy, its women did so as well. The women who had loved, advised, and in her case manipulated those men. But she had survived. She had known men to fall, but she would not suffer the same fate. The moon had hung low over Rawalpindi, sending long shadows through streets once filled with the pulse of power. But tonight this was a city betrayed by its gods, the very same ones who had once smiled at General Rani and court of military officers, politicians, and sycophants. Her realm was not one of thrones and crowns, but of whispered favor and unspoken debts. Tonight, however, it was all quiet. Silence, Rani understood, was the worst way to be left. The wine and roses had been replaced by not days, but decades of rage that they would dedicate to taking power back. The Queen of Power, General Rani, sat in a poorly illuminated room, letting her fingers caress the cold marble skin of that teacup with no warmth left. The wealth of her youth had fallen away like brown leaves, but what was left to her now was that bright mind chalking up numbers and keeping watch. She knew long ago that power was inconstant, and only those who grasped its instability would survive the changing tides. She feared this was it, not just for Yahya, but also for her. She had imagined she could outlast it all, the men, the politics, and above all the betrayals. But the commission, methodically exposing secrets, dragged all of it into daylight. So many things and people that influenced her stayed in the shadows, but there was no more shadow for protection. The day she got a letter was one of those damp mornings steeped in depression. It was from an old friend. One had been with her in the days gone by, but still holding a leverage with the men in power. "The commission will be after you shortly. Be ready," he wrote. For a long time she looked at the letter, running her finger over its thin folds. "Be ready," it said. But how could she prepare for that? There had always been whispers, but they'd never strayed away from the group of people who owed her a favor. But the commission was different. They could force her from the cocoon of silence and reveal all her constructed facades. The general's queen, Rani, who had never bent to anyone, would have to respond. Images flashed through her mind, blurring her eyes. There were days when her words had been law, and if a man attracted to the idea of being promoted or getting an easy favor wanted something from Yahya, but dared not speak directly to him, he sought her out and secured permission. Her parties for the cream of society had become legend, emblematic of the moral decay that the commission was now uncovering. But what you couldn't see behind those nights of indulgence were deeper truths, the kind that no report would ever be able to fully capture. A knock on the door, faint and persistent. The servant she was left with, one of the very few who appeared at her presence, came in and bowed low. "It's someone who wants to see you," he said. "That's right," she agreed, waving the servant away. Straightening, she drew herself up as her guest was ushered in. It was a man she had known, now haggard. "The commission," he began, without preface of any sort whatever, "is waiting for you." The words were not unexpected, but they struck her as a blow. She'd known this time would come, had been expecting it for weeks even, and yet still the finality of it struck her. She thought for a moment of refusing. After all, she had defied so many men before, but this was different. There wasn't any back and forth or wielding of influence. This was not a game to control. This was a reckoning, or maybe a beginning of a retribution. "I will be there," she replied as the man walked away in silence. It was a dim wood-paneled courtroom, where the commission comprising of Chief Justice Hamudur Rahman, 2 Senior Justice Anwar al-Haq and Tufil Rahman, 2 additional members from Baluchistan High Court and military advisor Lieutenant General, retired. Altaf Kadir sat to listen to the evidence. As she walked into the room, it smelled like old books and damp papers, a place where power changed hands not through large-scale affairs of state, but with cold air and calculated words. The men around the long table in front of her embodied to her, and millions like her, a new Pakistan, one that would strive to rid itself of the corruption and moral rot it believed had ushered in its darkest days. Not even now, not after all the years and losses, she'd been called the Rani for a reason because of who she was, and who she would be all the way to her grave. The questions hit gradually at first, the men moving forward with careful words, but she remained calm. Her responses were just as frigid and dispassionate as the legend she'd made of herself. Yes, she had met Yahya Khan. Yes, she had been planning the parties. Yes, she had helped bring men to power. No, she had never been a part of this corruption that could now bring them all down. The room hushed as commissioners looked at one another. They wanted more, something akin to a confession, crumbling of the woman who had once ruled. But Rani wasn't about to give them the satisfaction. She wouldn't give them the truth they wanted, because the truth was hers alone. As the arguments closed, Rani knew that the world would never understand her. The commission might depict her as the personification of everything that had failed in the country, yet she knew it was more nuanced than this. She had played the game of power, and she was better at it than any man. Ultimately, she had survived, and that was her triumph. The corridors of power that had once buzzed with whispers about indulgence now reverberated with uncertainty. The commission had begun to expose the nation's dark secrets, and for every revelation that came out of a witness's mouth, It was as if some new section of the old world was falling away into dust. But she remained standing among the ruins. She had not admitted to what they wanted her to. She was too smart to play her last card. It was cold outside when she left the commission, the wind stinging her skin. She smiled, though it was a little defiant. She had met the commission and she had beaten them. Every day, as she sat by herself in her darkened home at night after the sun had set and cast its divine last rays over glittering domes, she thought back to when power had been hers. Aghajani, her Yahya Khan, had once looked to her for advice and pleasure, a role she reveled in. She had reigned without a throne, twisting the hearts and bending the desires of men in uniforms who carried rifles and led soldiers. And though her kingdom had tumbled, and the men she once ruled over now lay in ruins, there still stood a queen, even in exile. It had been some weeks since she was before the commission, but betrayal still stank in the air. The political terrain had crumbled like sand with Bhutto trying to glue together the fragments of a shattered nation. Ironically, she didn't miss it. Bhutto had been the one begging her for an introduction to Yahya, and now he held the country's reins. He had risen, and she and Yahya had fallen. He had always been ambitious. His eyes were animated with visions of power. And now, as the commission bore down on the failures of Yahya's administration, Bhutto was poised to ascend to power. While she flipped the pages of history, recalling how Bhutto had treated Yahya after defeat, it was not a mere shooing away, it was willful humiliation. Bhutto ensured that Yahya would be stuck in his house, stripped of all military awards and title. The once mighty general, who had ruled the country, was stripped away as he sat like a caged dog in his own home. Bhutto made him the fall guy for everything that had gone wrong. He held him responsible for the disaster, as well as its aftermath and fall of East Pakistan. It was all a ruse by Bhutto, to redirect the country's outrage away from himself and onto Yahya. But Bhutto was careful. He did not put Yahya through a public trial or confinement outside the nominal house arrest. That would have angered the military too much, and Bhutto knew he could not afford to do that. Instead, he allowed the commission to hang out Yahya's corruption and his excesses during war. It was sufficient to ruin Yahya's reputation, but not quite destabilizing enough so as to completely disrupt the delicate balance of power. Bhutto released him from house arrest a few years later, but by then Yahya was history. Thereafter, in humiliation and obscurity, he dragged out the rest of his days, a man who had wielded supreme control now, but as it were its ghost. Bhutto was a smart one. He knew how to smother Yahya without smashing everything else. But Rani knew she was a remnant of a regime he had outgrown, and in his new world, she was an unsafe relic. Yahya was out of the picture, but she posed a threat, so he had to destroy her. It was no surprise. The want for control, the ambition in his eyes, Rani had witnessed it all. Men like Bhutto left no loose ends, and Rani, who knew too much about the nuts and bolts of Yahya's regime, was that ultimate loose end. So he did what powerful men do. He silenced her, placing her under house arrest and cutting off access to the networks she once controlled. The world was no longer hers, and she felt that loss like a dark wound. The party invitations, the bureaucrats, and all those favors, they were all gone. She was a vestige. Her power had ebbed into memory. And in that memory, she discovered both solace and torment. One morning, a letter arrived. It was unsealed without the stamp of an official seal. It was just a plain envelope, slipped under her door. Rani gazed at it for a moment, then picked it up, her fingers feeling around the borders. Her expression impatient, she cracked the cover and found a page with words written in a hand that was all too familiar. Rani, the tempest may have subsided, but we are left with debris. They talk about you behind your back, but they are still afraid of you. There is too much for you to know, and in this game, knowledge poses graver risks than any weapon. Bhutto watches you, be careful. A friend. Rani's lips crept for a small, stingy smile. A friend, really. In this world, friendships are equal to coin, bartered as a favor. There are no genuine friends in the hallways of authority, only alliances, and alliances could be punctured as easily as a whisper. Nonetheless, she is not as secure as Bhutto would like her to be forgotten. Not in the way she used to anyway, but in the confidences she holds. Bhutto may be in control of the nation, but Rani is in control of the narratives that can topple him. That night, Rani sat near the casement of her dwelling, gazing out at the sunrise. The roads were quiet, the enclave hushed up under the heaviness of its own jeopardy. Yet she can distinguish the thrum of life as it goes on minus her. She was no longer the queen of the general. She pondered Bhutto's victory to power on the spikes of assurances and deceptions. He became the deliverer of a shattered country, but Rani was cognizant of the fact that it was a deceptive story. She witnessed hands holding Bhutto in his desperate hour. She remembered his grumbled appeals for favor. Good guys don't salvage a country, they utilize it. When they are accomplished, they cast it aside, much as he did Yahya and then her. However, Rani was not to be the one who could conveniently be binned. She went through an interrogation and came out on the other side, untouched, not owing to her chastening but owing to knowledge. She had observed two powerful men ascend and fall. It was just a question of when. Rani received more letters as the days went by. Some were from old contacts, offering cryptic words of warning or condolence. The rest came from those who wanted her help, in hopes that she could still pull strings behind the scenes. But Rani had learned not to act in haste. The opportunity for the action had come and gone. This was the time to be patient, to wait, and wait she did. The nights became longer, the air cooler, but Rani stayed in her silent house and watched, listened. An empire had been taken from her by men, but the tailies that she hoarded and stored against could destroy anyone who had ever forgotten her. One night when the wind was moaning outside, she sat at her desk with a feeble candle fluttering beside it. She took a sheet of paper, and her hand was firm as she began to write. The words came easily, each like a dagger pointed at those who had betrayed her. To the one who rules, she wrote, you've turned your back on from where you come from, but the past is never really past. It bides its time there in the shadows until it's ready to make itself known. Not forget me. I have not forgotten. She folded the letter neatly and put it in an envelope. It would be dispatched tomorrow, but not to Bhutto. It would get in the hands of somebody who could put it to use. Looking at the shadows on walls and the candle flicker, Rani smiled. The game was not over yet. The outside world had moved on, but she was still stuck in a place where time didn't tick. The days melted into nights, and the city, its leadership in flux and loyalties fluid, was by now a world away from that over which she used to preside. But within her home, the walls of it kept a sphere that seemed ready for any moment. The letters she dispatched, subtle and carefully worded, had sent waves coursing through centers of power, but no one dared speak her name. One night a visitor came, an acquaintance from her past. He was plainly dressed, but Rani sensed the air of importance that cloaked him. His face was older, with lines that had creased in years of dealing with the political turbulence in the country, but his eyes carried a heaviness from his past. You haven't changed one bit, Akleem, he whispered as he walked into the room. There was no formality between them. And neither do you, Rani replied, her voice a silken hiss. But I'm curious, what do you want here now? Is the past gripping you in your present? The man, one of the most prominent bureaucrats in Yahya Khan's disgraced government, smiled weakly, but there was no feeling in it. He seemed heavy, as if time itself weighed him down. He sat down without even waiting for her to offer him a seat. The whispers are constant, he said after a pause. I figured you'd let them fade, but I can see that you're just as much a part of the future of this country's gone-by years as its present. She cocked her head, a mannerism she employed whenever pertaining to intrigues that involved careful listening, as if the eyes slanting at him could bore through his diplomatic sweet talk. And what do they say of me? She said, though she knew the answer. They say you know too much, that you've never really gotten off of the stage. Some are afraid. Others, they are wondering if perhaps you could be useful once more. The silence became a thick, palpable layer, punctuated only by faint hum of city life beyond the windows. Rani was always good for something. Power was not loyal, power had no morality. It stuck to the adept, leaving when its grip was lost. The smile on Rani's face was back, colder than the previous one. And what do you wonder? You still think of me as useful? The man squirmed in his chair, a look of unease passing over his face. You never have to wonder, you just find a way. Her gaze bore into him. The tension in the air seemed heavy. He was a dinosaur of an era gone by, and yet he pursued her because he knew she still held the threads to that past. And in Pakistan, the past was never quite buried. When he left that night, Rani stood by her window looking out onto the darkened street. The game was different now. The faces were different, the stakes risen, but still it was all the same. Survival, manipulation, and secrets, these were the only currencies that counted. The commission's findings had sullied the reputation of many, but she'd somehow slipped through its clutches. Her role was spoken of in whispers, but she had deftly shielded herself from being sucked into the fiercest controversies. But she was not free. The commission had uncovered the truths of the powerful, yet there remained layers she held alone, and those truths were her last moves on the chess board. 2 weeks later, a second caller followed. This one was younger, with the bright eyes of a man who had yet to give up hope or atone for his naivete in matters of power. One of Bhutto's ministers sent him, although he wouldn't say so explicitly. She knew the signals, the well-chosen words, the subtle questions. Curiosity was burning them up to know what secrets she might possess, secrets that might reach well beyond Yahya Khan's fallen regime. The young man in front of her was all but shaking with nerves. "Madam, it is believed by some that you," he hesitated a bit and spoke and continued, "could assist in illuminating certain questions." Rani smiled indulgently. "What matters are those? The war, the generals, there are missing details," he stammered, trying to collect himself. Rani sank back in her seat, fingers running around the rim of her cup. "Clarity is in short supply these days, and it just cracks me up how people truly want clarity when it helps them, and then shadows when not so." Young man faltered. He had come anticipating something different, maybe more straight answers, or a withered old woman who'd trade what she knew for some temporal benefits. But Rani was no old biddy to be patted and patronized. "I believe," she went on, her voice soft but insistent, "that those who hunger for clarity should be careful what they wish for. The past has a way of bubbling to the surface when you least expect it, and not everyone will be pleased with what they find." The young man's face lost a little color. He had thought of her as someone weak like so many others before him. "I'll pass your message," he said, standing up to go. Rani followed the direction he had taken, never once losing that smile. Bhutto's left-wing government was a little more secure than Yahya had been, and it all could come undone, right in the tender quiet of her solitude. She had achieved the understanding that there were requests, warnings even from others she was hearing. All of them were caught in the complex web of power she'd once wielded so masterfully. She picked up a pen and started writing once more. Her hands didn't shake, her words came slow. And it was just about time for her to remind those in power facts. "Your time is running out," she wrote, "but I remain." She wrote her name, Akleem Akhtar, the woman who had outlasted them all. The dead of winter had clamped down, and as the wind howled outside, she sat at her old mahogany desk gazing at the chessboard before her. This wasn't just a game, it was her life as she'd lived it. The parts were all in place, the board having been scoured and burnished by years of play. She played this game with generals, politicians, and bureaucrats, and although she had been weakened in many a contest, the final checkmating would yet be hers. And on a neat fold on the desk lay her letter, with dry and acid ink, bold as the brain that had written it. It wasn't a letter for any one person, it was a letter to power itself. It was a reminder to the rulers that they, too, were only players in this game of chess, participants on the board however high up they might think themselves. When she woke up the following morning, Rani heard a knock on the door. The door was opened by serving girl. She came back accompanying a woman who looked nervous, holding a tiny leather-bound book against her chest. "Madam Rani," the woman inquired, her voice not much louder than a whisper. Rani looked at the young woman for a moment, then nodded. "Sit down," she pointed to a chair by the window. With an embarrassed air, the young woman took her seat, dropping the book onto the table before her. "I bring a message," she started, her nervous hands shaking. "From a mutual friend. He said you might be able to help." She arched an eyebrow and said nothing. The game was on once more, and she assumed not to give away the hand just yet. She just nodded, prompting the girl to proceed. "The commission," the woman said, looking around as if even the walls could hear her, "it has raised some questions. About what happened in 1971, about those who were involved. There are loose ends, things that haven't been exposed yet." Smiled. "Loose ends," she echoed. "There are always loose ends in a war like that, and sometimes they are left open intentionally." The young woman shifted uncomfortably. "But they want answers. The new leadership, they want to tie everything up." Rani chuckled softly. "Bhutto wants to clear up the mess, does he? He would like to be remembered as the one who saved this country from destroying itself. But he underestimates that the past won't be left so easily behind." The girl's eyes opened a little wider. "He thinks you might still have details." The report omitted that. Her smile disappeared and her voice became a chill. "What does he think I know? That it was actually conceived by me." I guided the reins while men like Yahya Khan took us into. The young woman gazed at her hands. I don't know, madam, but they are searching for scapegoats. Yahi, scapegoats, she said again thickly, as if the word tasted nasty going down. That's what they think I am. The woman kept quiet. When the young woman left, she sat in silence pondering upon a history that seemed to weigh upon her. Bhutto was smart, too smart, perhaps. He also knew that a clean break with the old regime would cement his power. But she was not going to be so easily disposed of. She had been part of the machinery that propelled some of her country's darkest days, yes, but she also witnessed the fissures in that machinery. And she also knew that Bhutto, with all his charm and intellect, was no less fallible than the men who had preceded him. She rose from her desk and crossed to the bookshelf on one wall of her study. Buried in the dozens of volumes on poetry and history were all memories jolted down on pieces of papers written down through the years. They were crammed with names, dates, and conversations, some that were never to be made public, others capable of destroying powerful men if they came to light. She took few pages from its place on the shelf and flipped on to a random page. The ink was a little dim, but the words were plain. She read them one by one, her mind drifting back to the days when she herself was at the center of it all. Yahya's birthday party, Lahore. Nur Jahan shows up tardy and barely able to stand from drunkenness, cannot perform. Agha Jani is furious, directs Tarana to sing as a replacement. Rumors circulate among the guests. Bhutto is rumored to have been overheard in a private conversation with one of Yahya's top advisors. The balance is going to change. She folds the page and returns it back to the shelf. She thought for a while and then she sat down at her desk again with a blank sheet of paper before her. She took up her pen and started writing. The words came easily, each one of them well thought out. To those who feel they have one, she wrote, "Power is never truly yours. It is only borrowed. And the past is never as far behind you, like to believe." She signed and sealed the letter. It was not addressed to Bhutto as such. Soon enough he would hear about it. It wasn't for the men and women, too many of them, still hanging in believing that they could somehow erase the past or control narrative. The following day the letter made its way to the corridors of power. It would change hands many times before it reached the person it was intended to, but she was not in a rush. Sitting by the window, watching the city come to life, she chuckled to herself. The chessboard remained in play. The house was quiet, but the city outside had begun to waken. The streets were filled with noise selling, engines humming, and the muffled hum of a world around. But in the stillness of her fortress, time stood frozen within a never-ending twilight. There was darkness somehow soaked into everything, remnants from past refusing to simply bleach away. She had sent the letter days ago, and there had been no reply, but she wasn't expecting one. It had never hurt to be patient. The letter would take time, she knew, threading its way through the labyrinth of hands and minds that had to search for the meaning they thought it contained, all asking each other what power she still had. But she did not want their answer. The silence was enough. In her world, silence spoke louder than words. It was a narrative of fear, of caution, and the men who now found themselves looking over their shoulders unsure if they had successfully buried that woman in her past. That afternoon, another acquaintance from gone by days dropped in. Weathered from years of political wrangling, his face held the burden of secrets he could never reveal. He had once been among Yahya's most trusted advisors, a man who had served her the whole of her reign. But he too was now a relic of another time. "Rani," he grunted when he entered the poorly illuminated room. His voice was courteous, but with the caution of a man who had known her strengths. She motioned him to sit and drew her fingers over the edge of her teacup. "It's been a while," she said, her voice breaking the silence. He said, sitting down across from her. "Too long. But I guess we knew this day would come." She arched an eyebrow, waiting for him to go on. "The letter," he replied, leaning forward after a moment, "has caused quite a stir." "I supposed as much," she said, lifting her tea to sip it coolly. He sighed, running a hand over his face. "Bhutto is worried. His ministers are whispering. They don't know what you're doing, but they wonder if somewhere inside there's something there, a weapon." She smiled, but it was not a warm smile. "And what do they think that I have? A treasure of secrets. Evidence that would crumble this government." The man gazed in her direction, squinting. "Isn't that what you've got?" She set the teacup down lightly, its delicate porcelain barely clacking against the table. "I have only the truth. And the truth, my friend, is far more powerful than any documents or revelation. Her guest squirmed in his seat. You're playing a dangerous game, Rani. Bhutto isn't Yahya. He wouldn't have any qualms about getting rid of you if he considers you a dangerous element. She looked him directly in the eyes, her face never changing. Bhutto is too good to me and knows where I stand. He's just like everyone who came before him. Ambition blinds them all. And then when they fall, it's always unexpected. The man sighed once more, rocking back in his chair. You can't keep on living in a bygone era. The world has changed. The game has changed. Her eyes briefly flashed some unreadable expression. The game is the same every time, she said softly. Only the players change. After the visitor left, she sat alone in her study as the sun sank below the horizon, replaying their conversation in her mind. She knew the man had a point. Bhutto was not Yahya. His was a different kind of ruthlessness, one that tolerated no opposition. And for him, she represented an exposed end in his chess game. In the morning, she received a letter pushed under her door. This one, unlike the others, was imprinted with a plain seal, Bhutto's government. She opened it with trembling fingers while her eyes skimmed the words, Madam, you are requested to appear for a private meeting at the Prime Minister's office. There are matters of importance that require your attention. Z. A. Bhutto, she smiled to herself. Bhutto, as it appeared, had finally chosen when and how he would strike. He'd been avoiding her for months, leaving his ministers and advisors to handle things until he convinced himself that everything was going to be all right again. But as the storm drew closer, he realized that he had to handle things on his own. The following morning, she put on the special sari with a plain but elegant garment that whispered quiet authority. The cold of the winter air cut into her skin as she stepped out, but for once it felt nice. It was a reminder that she wasn't dead yet. The drive to the Prime Minister's office was quiet. The streets were empty. The city was different from when she and Yahya Khan ruled, but change is also inertia. It was power moving in invisible ways, as with currents under the surface. She was led, when she landed in the office, into a small, dark room. The atmosphere was tense, and she could feel the guard's eyes on her waiting. Bhutto's office was nearby, and she knew he would be getting ready for her. The door opened, and a long, shadowed figure entered. It was Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. He was as impressive-looking as ever, with the weight of his position cutting into his sharp features. Their eyes, dark and calculating as they were, met, and for just a moment, the two of them assessed the other like as if one measuring his opponent. Rani, Bhutto said, his voice low and commanding. It's been too long. She made a little inclination of her head in return for his salutation. Prime Minister, she said. I tell you, I was starting to think that had forgotten about me. Bhutto smiled. It was not a warm smile. I could never forget you. Settling back with a familiar glint in his eyes, he picked up the bottle. Scotch, he inquired, his voice silky with a touch of wistfulness running through it. She smiled, and between them memories floated like smoke from a long-lost fire. For old time's sake. Yes, can we please, she said. He poured out the amber liquid which set itself aglow in his fingers as they sat silently sipping drink that once flowed freely during days of power and passion. And in silence they drank not only to the past, but also its impermanence, of empires built and dreams lost and moments that now slid through their fingers. So you have finally found your voice. That's quite an honor. As she gazed intently into his eyes. I'm not one to waste time, he said, leaning in slightly. You know why I've called you? She raised an eyebrow. Do I? His expression darkened. The commission, there are still questions. They are looking to your role, the hold you had. They want answers to nail us. She stopped smiling and leaned back in her chair, never taking her eyes off Bhutto. People are always seeking answers, she murmured. But the truth is often not what they want. Bhutto's gaze hardened. This isn't a game. The country has almost collapsed. We cannot risk any more loose ends. There was a cold glint in her eyes. Is that what I am to you? A loose end. He didn't respond right away, his fingers drumming softly against the edge of his chair. You were part of the old regime. You're the symbol of everything that wasn't right. The parties, the corruption, the excess. You saw it all. Her voice turned icy. I was there, yes, but remember, so were you. The room went quiet, her words suspending like a sword between them. He glared at her, but he stayed cool. You knew Yahya better than anyone, he said in a voice soft but dangerous. You knew what was going on. You knew the choices we made and how they brought me here to victory. Her lips tightened. Yahya made his choices. I did not hold his hand when he signed the papers that would send this nation into turmoil, but you had power, he insisted. And that's what matters. She looked at him for a moment, working through the layers of his words in her mind. Bhutto wasn't simply seeking answers. He was looking for control. Tie up the dangling ends of yesterday so he could reign free from interference, clear-eyed and unhaunted by ghosts at every step. I understand, she said after a pause, her voice composed. You want me to fade away quietly, is that it? You want to forget that woman who knows too much? Bhutto's eyes narrowed. I want peace, Rani, for the country, for the people. Rani chuckled softly. Peace. There is no peace, Bhutto, not for men like you, not for men like Yahya. Power never brings peace. Bhutto leaned forward, his voice almost a whisper. You're not untouchable. You may have gotten through the commission, but you're still part of this nation's history. And history will consume you whole if you don't watch out. Her gaze didn't waver. History didn't swallow me, Bhutto. I am history. The meeting ended on a frosty note, Bhutto's last words still ringing in her ears as she was led back to the car. As she rattled through the city in her car, it was difficult to contain herself. Bhutto had not been vague. He wanted her out of the way. She would fight back. The storm was coming, and she could sense its winds gathered to a new pitch. The days after she saw Bhutto were more peaceful than any she had known. The Prime Minister's admonition rang in her ears like the sound of a bell tolling distantly from some forgotten room, but she was good at silence, at making them think. The letter from Bhutto, which she had sent to him, sat in the corner on top of desk, a constant reminder that all bets were off. For all his charisma and vision, he was playing a dangerous game. He wished to forget the old order, yet distance himself of any relation with destruction that had resulted in the breakup of East Pakistan. That night, as the city slept under Bhutto's rule of deception, she resolved to escape and see Yahya. No fanfare or whispers, just a thread she wanted to connect as a final goodbye to the one she loved. Yahya, once a great general who had ruled Pakistan with an iron fist, now was trapped in his home, disgraced, humiliated and away from power, but never too far from her touch. Upon her arrival, his eyes grew soft, a trace of the man he used to be once in that warm light. They sat, close yet apart in the split couch, and between them a bottle of scotch whose amber flicked like old flames. He poured, touching her hand as he handed over the glass to her, and for a few moments there existed no world beyond them. Silently, they sipped against the passage of time. Their conversation started the same way it always did, memories of days lost, nights spent in laughter and secrets shared as whispers. They talked about the fall, Bhutto's speedy assumption to power, how so much in politics had changed. But underneath those words were unspoken understanding, a knowingness that transcended politics. Despite the wear of years, his eyes were still sharp as they rested on her face, searching almost as though to capture every feature one last time. But soon the talk shifted into something more private, more intimate. As the night wore on, there was an unbearable thickness in air between them. She moved closer, kicking their knees together as his hand landed gently on hers. Her heart pounded with the bittersweet burden of their past, all those stolen glances, forbidden touches. He was close now, his breath warm on her skin, and for a moment it felt as if nothing had changed at all. She let his hand grab the back of her neck and clamp it closer. It was a kiss of old yearnings, bygone years, and the love that had always remained silent beneath, heated but unspoken. It was tender, unhurried. It contained everything they could never express to each other, a final act of defiance directed at the world that had torn them apart. His hands were around her, and she let herself fall into the moment because it was all that they had left. After making love, laying naked, their bodies pressed together, neither spoke. Words were unnecessary. They could hear their heartbeats, rising and falling. Lull between them filled with comprehension, dulled by the heaviness of what had been and would be no more. The night was dying, and so were they. She stood up to leave, the weight of it all bearing heavily on her heart. He rose as well, his hand resting on her waist a second longer than necessary in an attempt to secure the thread of what had been left between them. She looked at him and saw, for the first time in his eyes, not only a defeated general, but also the man she had loved passionately. They dressed up quietly. There were no goodbyes. He saw her turn to leave and the sound of her footsteps go further and further away into the cold night. She didn't glance back, and yet she knew he was watching her as darkness enveloped her. And as she felt herself slip away, the cold around her felt like a final embrace. She knew this was it. They'd shared a drink, kissed, made love, laughed, but now they would have to live deafening silence. As she was nearing the main gate, she heard Yahya call her Rani. Yes, Aghajani, she turned back to look at him. Destroy him, Yahya replied. I will, she said, and turning on her heel, walked away. Yahya had passed out of her life now forever. The empire they built together had been reduced to rubble, and all that was left were echoes, endless echoes of a bygone life filled with passion, power, and regret, followed by whispers lost into the night like the final memory of his kiss. In the smoky corridors of history, down where power and passion mate like desperate lovers in a trance, she witnessed Bhutto's rise. However, the last words of Yahya, destroy him, kept on haunting her. She had seen Bhutto as a brilliant statesman, his mind on fire with political dreams and personal yearnings. But he was a man of paradoxes, between public duty and private indulgence. Bhutto, she recalled, was a man who hungered for women for his appetite. When she thought of him, it was the image of him stalking across bars and embassies, a silk-lipped foreign diplomat whose eyes strayed too long and whispered promised sedition and sex indiscriminately. His diplomacy was not only in chambers of politics, but also in perfumed boudoirs of high society. He was not only leader of the state, but was lover of flesh. There were women, countless and different, who had come for him like moths to the light for his power and position. Those seductions were not just carnal abandonments, but rites of passage, exercises in power play, scripted with silk and scented notes, moves that hovered on the borders of conquest and communion. For him, women were just pets for his many hunts, like a predator boasting to prey about how it enjoyed its organs before moving on. With a poet's tongue and tyrant's thirst, he dated the world. But below the silk and scandal, she glimpsed a man who always hovered on the brink, of statesman or sinner, soon-to-be lover or lifelong liar. Her words seemed to come as more of a lament than an accusation. Her voice sounded of a woman who had witnessed too much and had been silenced for far too long. His private life was shrouded in complete secrecy because of his political ambitions. However, in Husna Sheikh, his clandestine, undeclared wife, not only did he find a lover, but also an intellectual parody. It was a secret muttered in the living rooms, but also was indicative of Bhutto's dual nature, of his inability to separate the absolutism of power from the absolutism of love. Bhutto's oath to Husna, his strive to maintain her needs with the needs of his declared wife Nusrat Bhutto, implied an impossibility. For Husna, the dream of acknowledgement instead of being a concubine grew, while Nusrat's visibility was loud in the daytime. The end to their love was predictable, a futile using and walking away from women when their age and sexual pull withered. Bhutto, who had once been her friend and the brightest star in Pakistan's political scene, was now becoming a tragic figure. For common people, he was a man whose rise to power had been filled with hope and grandeur, but which eventually foundered under the weight of betrayals. She'd seen men like him rise and fall before, but with Bhutto the effect was different. Perhaps it was that she had seen the man behind the mask, the one who wept in Husna's arms, the one gullible enough to believe his own myth while choking under its weight. She had seen a lot of political appointments in her time, but when Bhutto plucked General Zia-ul-Haq over the heads of senior and more established generals as army chief, she smelled trouble. Zia was an unimpressive man, who did maintain a menacing silence, but Bhutto mistook the apparent sycophancy for loyalty. She, with that keen power eye of hers, knew better. Zia, she saw, was a man of bottomless ambitions waiting for the right moment. Blinded with a desperate desire for control, Bhutto believed he had put at the helm of the military nothing but a pawn. But as she watched the turning tides of politics, she knew that Zia's ascent would not lead to servitude but dominion. It was as though, for her, Bhutto had inadvertently offered his own fate to a wolf in sheep's clothing that would wait until long after being fed before mauling the hand that had once given it sustenance. This appointment was not just a misstep, but also betrayed Bhutto's own instincts. A catastrophic one that she knew would change the course of history and bring in an era even he had no means to anticipate. She knew that his strength was transitory, but she needs to act fast for the price he had to pay for the humiliation he meted out to Yahya and many others whose names he was leveraging on. In the power-sharing games, Bhutto appointed Ghulam Mustafa Kar as Governor Punjab. Kar, Bhutto's closest friend, Infamous for womanizing and scandals, was someone whose feudal egotism could have been the very politics that Bhutto railed against. She had seen them together, laughing, scheming amid the trappings of wealth and power. She'd known men like Khan and Bhutto all too well, their desire for dominion over others, the belief that they could turn around destiny. In upper-class society, where power wore the guise of charm, Khan was majestic, magnetic for those who whispered and gazed. It was an exclusive occasion. Crystal glasses clinked and soft laughter wafted like perfume in the air. His memory was of a man who sounded as though he had filled an auditorium. Women swarmed to him, their eyes wide with just how amazing he was as they hung on every fucking word. "That's Mustafa Khan," they used to say, as if his name were itself legendary. Yet beneath the spell of his magnetism was a darker and more sinister reality, that of a man whose lust for power went much further than just politics. The ambition of Mustafa Khan was not about political domains alone, but was directed towards women with broken lives who fell victim to his infatuation. It started with Safia, the humble flight attendant whose fate happened to connect her life path with him caught by his fancy. He married her in a whirlwind romance, and then locked her away in the village of Katadu. She lived in isolation behind the walls of his ancestral home. Once a liberated woman, she diminished to a forgotten wife whose only function was now simply to bear him children. Their daughter withered away without medical care, a tragedy that barely registered amid his busy life. Safia was ultimately summoned from her exile in Katadu to the governor's house, but the veneer of respectability was short-lived. Mustafa's siblings, who were self-proclaimed guardians of the family's honor, had accused her and Mustafa's younger brother Gulem Murtaza of having an illicit love affair. In fury, Mustafa divorced her and sent his brother into exile in Britain. Safia wasn't the only one who suffered Mustafa's rage. He had beaten her to a pulp, breaking ribs, when her infidelity was discovered. Even more horrifically, he had red chili powder put inside the body of their children's nanny, Aisha, as a punishment for failing to inform him about Safia. His repression was not just of the physical variety, but extended all across life itself. Even women near him lived in terror, not knowing how he could prove to be one unpredictable SOB. His cousin Wazir was another victim of his feudal supremacy. Married to him, she bore his child, but her function was seasonal. Mustafa's hunger for fresh women caused him to dump her, and the old men promptly annulled the marriage by transferring this girl to another man as if she were a piece of merchandise. Then there was Firdaus, who he married in a moment of compassion and whom she considered was someone God had sent to save her. His alliance with Firdaus was doomed from the beginning, springing forth not out of love but pity, and ended just as easily. For Mustafa, women were fleeting objects of utility to be fucked or married and disposed after use as he rises through the ranks. Eventually, as she lay in the hospital, recovering from childbirth, he sent her divorce papers and cut her off as easily as he had pulled her out of slavery. His frequent encounters were generally in the misty hills of Murray with paid companion ions. In the bedroom, his nature of lust and violence got a taste of transactional sex where there existed no emotions or expectations. Among them was Nabahar, a professional dancer who caught his attention. He quietly married her in a modest ceremony, visiting her secretly by installing her as his mistress. But even Nabahar, like so many other, was discarded when Mustafa's political career hung in the balance. As governor, he couldn't acknowledge such a publicly open affair, and after pressure from Bhutto divorced her in what was the most feudalistic dismissal. While Mustafa backstabbed Bhutto, he was living a personal life in close association to feudal values. His encounters were not merely expressions of desire, but also assertions of dominance. In Sherry's case, his chauvinism brought her down to a shadow of himself. Like all the women in his life, Sherry was consumed by his overwhelming personality, engulfed daily in her own sense of subjugation. It was a pattern that would repeat itself in all of his marriages. Each woman who passed through the life of Mustafa, whether in marriage or forbidden seduction, was reduced by his need to dominate. As the tailies of Mustafa came to surface, his politics mingled with personal horrors. His relationships with women were not mere love affairs, but simply aspects of his proclivity for control, both in the private and public domain. He moved among women like political partnerships, never lovingly but forever instrumentalizing. For Mustafa, control was not just about women. His grasp reached into not only his friends and political allies, but also every part of his life. The friendship and rivalry between Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was a mirror to his double-edged personality. He could be staunchly loyal, but also treacherous when it suited him. One minute, he would fall in with Bhutto's vision. The next, as their disputes over resource sharing between Punjab and other provinces demonstrated, challenge him. Like his marriages, Mustafa's loyalties shifted with the wind, and he only ever followed one principle, that of might. And the chapter of Kar's life, in Rani's eyes, was not just about one individual, but also a window into feudal Pakistan. The women who shaped his life were representative of the larger oppression in a system that reveled in control and submission. From the wives he married and abandoned to the political figures he helped before betraying, Mustafa's priority was always power. Love and loyalty were simply commodities to be handed out, then tossed aside. All this debauchery continued to throw mud at Bhutto's government, and he turning a blind eye on the crimes of his friends in close circle. To his opponents, Bhutto was ruthless and unforgiving. She had seen that vengeance a year before, when the convoy of his opponent Nawab Mohammad Ahmed Khan Kassari was attacked, killing him on the spot through his newly established federal security force. This was despite the fact that his son Ahmed Raza Kassari was one of Bhutto's insignificant servant. She finally rose to her feet, determined, went over to telephone with Yahya's words, "Finish him," reverberating in her ears. She dialed a number. After few rings, she heard a man's voice. "Who is calling?" he asked. "It's Rani." There was a long silence at the other end of the line. After a pause, Kassari replied, "Yes, Rani, it's me. It's been a long time. I thought you had fled the country. No, I am still here, house arrested." "Fighting, though," she replied. "Sorry to hear about your father. He was killed in cold blood." "Yes, he was." Kassari's voice broke down. "Do you know who got him killed?" she asked. "No, not really," he replied. "I know. We have a common enemy." She smiled before putting down the phone. The fight and the time for retribution had just begun. The air was tense as the door inched open and an undercover agent walked in. "You have been sent, finally," she said softly. She did not stand up, but with a little movement of her hand, indicated to the visitor to sit in a chair opposite. The stranger just sat there, hands folded on his knees while staring blank-eyed into nothingness. "The generals are getting worried," he said, his voice low and precise as a knife blade. "But this game is dangerous. Bhutto still commands power. The opposition is gaining momentum, but his hold is firm." She smiled, a smile on her lips that meant she knew. She leaned closer and whispered, "Dangerous. Perhaps. But it is up to the generals to turn the table on him. What is that Zia up with his feet metaphorically already on top of the throne that Bhutto himself has lovingly offered to him? Doesn't he now?" Her shimmering gaze sparkled in a glimmer of light. She had not directly mentioned a coup, but was ready to use her power to help throw him out of power. The agent shifted slightly. "Zia, as you know, is waiting for the right moment." "But does he not still wear the face of a friend?" she asked, her question hanging heavily in the air. Loyalty is a frail cloth to be thrown aside when the time is right. Zia, though a cunning man, is indecisive. He is underestimating his power that amounts to a river which can crumble anything no matter how strong. So far, he is already undertaking the first quiet moves, forming alliances in shadowy rooms, but that is not enough. She interrupted herself, narrowing her eyes. "I can give Zia the key he needs to destroy him." There was no change in the agent's expression, but a look of realization crossed his eyes. "What of the streets?" he asked. "The people are up against Bhutto, yeah, but he still commands the army and the generals are scared of him." "Streets," her voice became pensive. "The streets are Bhutto's worst enemy now. The clouds are gathering, a struggle developing. He doesn't know it yet, but the farther down he pushes them, the higher will be stakes for him. And what can a government do when the streets roar their opposition? He will summon the army to control, and then it will be Zia's chess game. But frankly, as I can see, the army no longer has a soft corner for him. The day Bhutto summons them will be the day he will sign away his life." She stopped, leaving her statement to hang in the air, fingers lightly tapping on an armrest. "And when that time comes, I will be the one who will strike the killer blow," she continued, her voice turning deadly as a serpent's hiss. "The secrets I am privy to about Bhutto, his inner circles are enough to finish him. Zia knows this, and so do you. That's why you are here, she smiled at him. The agent settled back, thinking over what she just said. The commands from the generals to him were straightforward: collect information and listen. But what he felt after listening to her was more than just espionage. It was the shaping of fate and a smell of personal revenge, casting its heaviness on him. What you're thinking is not small, he said at last, his voice deliberately slow. But it's true that Zia cannot act alone, and there'll be others around to take his place if Bhutto falters. Yet still there are some generals within the military who are faithful to him, who would protect him at all costs. She smiled. And that, my dear friend, is where I will come in. Remember, loyalty is a fragile thing. It sways with the wind, and I am the wind. These generals you talk about, the ones who would defend Bhutto, either are already in Zia's pocket or will be within minutes. Their inherent greed for money and power renders them malleable. When Zia will act, it would be not with the military power alone, but will be followed by Bhutto's total elimination. That is where I will come in. She smiled. She rose, looking at the agent with sharp eyes. And you are the one who will take my message to Zia. Tell him the time is near, and very soon the streets will be in flames, and the army will have to march into control. And once they do, Zia will have the power he needs to take what he has been eyeing on. The agent stood up, his expression still carved in stone, but he had a clearer picture of what was at stake. I will convey your message, he said, his voice colder now and more firm. But remember this, if we fail, if Zia's gambit is unsuccessful, there will be nowhere in this land for any of us. Bhutto is not known for forgiving his enemies, and that, she said, stepping closer to him, her eyes meeting his directly, is why we must not fail. With a last nod he turned and left, vanishing into the night as soundlessly as he had entered. She sat there all by herself after he left, her eyes staring out the window into the night. A storm was on the horizon, and it would demolish everything Bhutto had created, but she'd be the unscathed eye of that whirlwind holding all its reins. In the stillness of the night, she sat shrouded in silence, watching the wind of destiny change. The game was on tonight, and all the pieces falling into play. The phone rang, breaking the silence. She heard the agent's voice, curiosity buzzing beneath the calm stillness. How did it all begin? She murmured, hardly above a whisper. The agent grinned, pausing while his hand holding the receiver tightly. It started as all coups start, quietly like a whisper. Zia understood that Bhutto's fall wouldn't happen with one bold stroke, but through the pressure already building around, he went on. She listened, counting back the steps that had brought her to this moment. The streets were ablaze with anger already. The election was heavily rigged. Political parties rallied behind the demand for re-elections. Bhutto had overestimated his popularity, holding the people too tightly and the masses finally pushing him back. Political rallies were gathering steam, the opposition becoming louder, and Zia, like a fox, was waiting to strike. She understood what Bhutto did not power, if taken too far, shatters everything. The luck runs out one day. The agent went on as she listened carefully. When Zia called his confidant generals and explained the plan, it was simple. A state of emergency would be declared immediately. The country's whole fabric would be tucked under martial law, quick and brutal. Bhutto would be ousted and put under house arrest in Murray, far from the capital, far from his people. She drew the receiver closer, hanging on every word. Do you think Bhutto saw this coming? She inquired, her voice stammering with excitement. Maybe, deep down, he knew that. But he, like all power-mad rulers who hold onto their thrones too long, thought himself untouchable, the agent replied. And when the military surrounded his house, he could not believe the coward Zia he promoted out of turn was capable of ordering his men against him. He has been shifted to Murray Rest House in the middle of the night, telling him that he is under house arrest and will be released soon. There was fanfare, no grand struggle. The generals who took him to the hill station assured that it was a temporary stage and the order had to be re-established so that he can come back and control things. But we knew, didn't we? Agent laughed. Zia is not going to let him slip away. She put down the phone and waited for the dawn. Few days passed without any reaction. The streets were quiet with controlled information leaked to the press. As she recounted, General Zia visited Bhutto in the guest house the next day. The air was foul, not because of the smell of smoke, but from the man history was too frightened to forget. Bhutto was wounded. He heard Zia's boots clonking down the hallway. As soon as he glimpsed Bhutto, his fingers started to shake. There was still some life left in the cigarette he was smoking, But as he looked into Bhutto's eyes, he immediately stubbed it out, deep into his own pocket, extinguishing not just a flame but his guilt. Zia had rehearsed a lot of things in his mind, but everything got erased the moment Bhutto uttered those words. "General," Bhutto stared at Zia, "have you read Article 6 of the Constitution and the penalty for abrogating the Constitution?" Zia froze. What had been a face of military action has been revealed. He was the fearful general, fearing the medals being stripped from his chest while facing the man he had betrayed. Breaking the silence, Zia responded to the question by mumbling some incoherent words about justice and closure. "You'll be out soon, sir," he said without looking at Bhutto. "I should better be," Bhutto replied. "You can go now, General." Zia turned on his heels to walk out, fearing a noose around his neck. He realized that there will be one grave and two bodies. He has to decide whose body it will be, his or Bhutto's. The agent called again after a few days. "Why Bhutto was released by your coward general?" she asked with her eyes narrowing. "The people have shown up for him in the millions. They still believe in him." Agent remained quiet, his voice not finding words. "Yes, Rani," Zia miscalculated there, perhaps. Or maybe he did it on purpose to assess his popularity. The people for sure love him, that's true. They are cheering and chanting his name in streets. At the rallies, he's going to have a sea of bodies, millions of them, all chanting the same thing, "Our leader." His voice became grimmer as he uttered these words. "Zia needs to act again," she spoke. "Fear is a powerful motivator." He, seeing Bhutto rise from the ashes with still considerable popularity among his people, has to realize that he had to act fast. There was a silence, tension as they both kept quiet. "Anyway, convey my message to Zia. Tell him, don't be a coward ass," and hung the line. In the coming days, Bhutto was arrested again, and this time not in the name of political order but under indictment, ranging various insignificant charges military men use against their opponents. Zia has not only to erase an opponent, but a legacy. Inside her room, it was all hushed stillness, but in her mind she heard the distant echoes, chains tightening on Bhutto's wrists. She got up and went to the window, where she looked into the night. What Zia had done was not just a political thing. It was about survival. Here, the power is not given, it's taken with blood and iron. He has no idea what it takes to bring a man like Bhutto down. But she knew, no throne is safe. Even Zia will one day become a shadow that he is casting at present. Power is only temporary. Bhutto, the lion of the people, had become a hostage of history. But for that to happen flawlessly, she had to help Zia. She picked up the phone, dialed Raza Kasseri's number. "Are you ready?" she asked. "Do I have a choice?" He replied with pain in his voice. "It will be a tough struggle. Are you sure, Raza? It was my father, Rani." He dropped the line. Sitting in the public gallery of Lahore High Court, though not seen, she found herself witnessing the proceedings where history was not written, but was being manipulated. As the trial unrolled, she could see very well that this was not a trial but an organized, orchestrated tragedy. The invisible hand of Zia, with her help, had orchestrated a performance, dark, deliberate, and deadly. Rani swaggered as she walked in with her slender. She knew Zia well enough to know the script. The whole thing smacked of a vendetta. He was out to ensure that Bhutto was not simply ousted, but obliterated from the political landscape of Pakistan. Bhutto was being accused of orchestrating the killing of Mohammed Ahmed Khan Kasseri, a serious charge. More disturbing still was how easily the evidences were being shaped to fit a preconceived verdict. She saw witnesses walk in with shaky voices and follow-up statements that were full of contradictions and fear. She could see it in their eyes, some brainwashed, others obviously prepped. She had seen power before, watched it warp and twist and devour, like a mewling child cries for its mother's breast, but had never seen justice perverted with such naked glee. The way Bhutto stood before the bench, his composure, stunned her. The planted judge, Justice Malvi Mushtaq, a man whose personal grudges against Bhutto were well known, headed the proceedings. Bhutto's lawyer, Barrister Yahya Khan, battling away, hurling every argument, every inconsistency in the prosecution case, but none of it seemed to matter. The judgment had already been written in Zia's office. The judges were only here to do a quick script read. A tense courtroom. Wooden panel walls dripping with colonial memory. Bhutto sitting on the defense bench, cool and crinkly-eyed, surveying the room like a statesman, not as an accused. For a moment she gazed at Bhutto, who showed no sign of fear. His eyes were uncannily calm, as if he had expected it all along. It was not a trial, but was a theater put on by the tyranny. Zia had scripted every moment of this show. Every move in the courtroom was like a dance under his whistle. Justice Mushtaq adjusting his glasses and speaks in a monotone, with lengthy pauses between his words. Mr. Bhutto, are you saying that the whole thing has been fabricated and is not true, just one big lie? He asked. I deny it absolutely, Bhutto replied. Even more than that, I reject the authority of this court. Gasps ripple through the gallery as he stares straight ahead at the board of judges. It wasn't Bhutto's arrogance, she sensed, but was his defiance that was clear. He recognized this as no place of truth. It was an execution chamber. Bhutto had once insulted Mushtaq, the presiding judge, over judicial appointments. It was a guise of legalism worn over the grim visage of a grudge, this time meting out reprisal not against an individual man, but against history. Bhutto's lawyer Yahya roars as he rises to his feet. There is no evidence that Mr. Bhutto was involved in the murder, my lords. Witnesses have been implanted. Reports contradict prosecution claims. This court does not have to sit around arguing semantics forever. The charge remains serious, Mulvi Mushtaq interrupted. So would you just hang me now or what? Bhutto shot back. If the verdict is coming from another place, then we should not fool ourselves and insult our law as though it still exists in the kangaroo court. A witness takes the stand. Nervous. Sweating. He speaks hesitantly. Actually, I want to take my statement back. I was pressured. I do not remember Bhutto ordering anything. Murmurs as the judges exchange glances. The prosecution jumped in. My lord, the witness is obviously suffering from public pressure. This is his original evidence that must be regarded as the true version. Retraction not granted, Mulvi Mushtaq ordered. That was the final blow, as she anticipated. The witnesses, gutsy enough to confess, but there was no one on the bench who was going to listen to the truth. There was horror in the court, with every plea sounding like a wail in a tomb sealed tight. Bhutto wasn't just the only one on trial, the nation's conscience was. And then came the final day of judgment. The courtroom was still as the judgment was read by Justice Mushtaq. Mr. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, this court sentences you today for the murder of Ahmed Khan Kasari. You and the FSF officers who acted on your orders will be hanged until each of you are dead. Raza Kasari, sitting in the courtroom, smiled. He and Rani did it. There was deafening silence in the courtroom. Silence. Bhutto did not flinch. So be it, Bhutto interrupted the justice. Remember one thing, Mushtaq, you are punishing an innocent man. You are extinguishing the future of Pakistan. She held her breath as the full sentence was read. Even the walls were crying. Despite all the vengeance she had against Bhutto, he had promised democracy and honor for a Pakistan emerging from the humiliation of surrender in East Pakistan. Today, the judiciary had also surrendered, standing exposed and humiliated like rest of the country. Crowds gathered outside the court were silent, some crying, others looked blank with disbelief. She was hidden among them. Their faces matched her own sorrow. It was not a man being ordered to kill, but a principle. It was hope which was lost forever. Zia, the ruthless dictator, would persist for decades, destroying the very fabric of the country step by step. Walking out of the courtroom amidst whispers and wet eyes, she felt an aching emptiness. The streets were full of people, lamenting and in shock. Despite her role, her heart painfully felt that it was not just Bhutto being sentenced that day, it was justice itself. The trusted institution became a tool, and worse, a power-hungry mad dictator would hold on to his position indefinitely, using and manipulating everything in the name of God. On this day, Bhutto was already dead. To some a martyr, to others a lesson. Minari Pakistan loomed distant. Shadows stretched long. In the city, in her quiet dark room, she lights a candle for Bhutto. Heavy silence in the jail. Long corridor was dimly lit. Air was heavy with the smell of rust, sweat, and dying history. Shadows traipsed through rigid rocks like trapped spirits. Footsteps echoed steadily. She wrapped in a shawl with her face hidden. It was not an ordinary night. She was walking to the grave of a man who still breathes, and a man who had once thought himself immortal. A man in plainclothes walks in front of her, fast, quiet. No one dares stop them. No one meets their eyes. They come upon a thick iron cell door. The man halts. He's inside. You have 30 minutes. She didn't respond. The man retreats, fatting in the shadows. She steps forward. The cell is small, cramped. A dimly lit lamp flickers, the bowl of stale food on the floor. There he was, the voice of the people, now disheveled. His hair grown, his clothes worn out. He wore a shawl around his shoulders. But his demeanor, as always, still a Bhutto. He hunches over a chair, its back to one wall, the shadows falling at his face. She saw him before he did. Bhutto stirs, turns. He wonders if she is a mirage, a phantom from his past he'd sought to escape. Rani, is this you? Yes. Additional secret and covert crap. It never occurred to me they'd let you hear. I still hold the remnants of the power I once had, she replied. The chair creaked as he pulled back for a second. She saw in his eyes a flicker of defiance just for a moment before it dies. He looked at her with eyes looking more like a wreckage. Eyes that once surveyed empires looked empty. So have you come to gloat? No, I've brought you a mirror. Her gloved hands griped the cell bars, making her shiver against the cold iron. Do you recall when you put me under unannounced house arrest? You had me followed, watched, silenced. But why? Because I was dangerous. Because I knew too much. Or because you feared the things I could bring into open, your sins. I had no choice, Rani. You always had a choice, Bhutto, as she moved closer, leaning in a little. I was the queen of shadows. Every shadow needs its light to cast. You stole my light, Zulfikar. You took my throne, my power, and my voice. And now, look at you, no throne, no party, no parade of sycophants. Only this creaking chair, this lonely night. She had not intended to hurt him. She only wanted to speak the truth he'd buried under ambition, under speeches, under the disguise of his deceptions. I did the best thing I knew was right. For the people, for Pakistan, he said, you made what you felt was the best decision for you. That's what power does to all of us. We wrap it in slogans. We justify it with flags. We create our own false sculptures. She went on. Are you forgetting what you did to your benefactor, your daddy, General Ayub? You silenced him. He could not take pressure and died of heart attack. Don't tell me now that it was not your doing. And now you are doing the same to Yahya, who handed over the country to you on a plate. He is dying bit by bit every day. You put all the blame of follies on him. He is suffering under the burden of humiliation. You were the architect of their ruin. Maybe I was wrong, Bhutto replied. Maybe we both were, she smiled. We are alike, you and I, diggers of our own graves. History will not bury us gently. A long pause. There was an intimacy shared between them in that silence. He looked down as if staring at his own feet. A heavy load, made up entirely of the weight of everything he had lost. She steps back slowly. They will come back soon. Who? He asked. The superintendent, the magistrate, the hangman. Someone might ask you if you want a prayer mat, a meal, a bath. Yet no purification can absolve the truth. He shivers. If I told you that I did try, would you believe me? I might have once, she replied. You need forgiveness. Not from me, but from history. But history is rarely kind to fallen titans. She heard footsteps approaching. Jail warden enters, grim-faced. Time's up. You need to leave, madam. Call me Rani. I need more time. The orders are strict. General Zia would not tolerate any deviation. Of course not. The general is inherently shameless. Warden remains quiet. She turns back to Bhutto. They look at each other, old enemies, old friends, victims of the same addiction. Power. Time to go. She looked at him for the last time. Their eyes met. There were no words but pain. There will be no healing. No retribution. Sorry, Bhutto, I never wanted this end for you. You destroyed us both. Turning back, she walks to the door as the corridor lights flicker. She does not look back. Today she walked out of his life forever. One behind bars, other behind memories. He was dead well before the gallows. The night in Rawalpindi was dense. The air seemed to be commanded by it to remain silent. The wind even stopped blowing. The leaves of the ancient neem trees outside the prison did not move. The light from the corridor lamps breathed a pale life, halfway between waking and dying, casting its sickly amber on cracked plaster. They read the warrant to him. The words, formal and cold. Bhutto nodded, just a little, pretending he was hearing, but his eyes looked blank. Or maybe it was the river of history flowing down his body. A guard cleared his throat. You can have your last bath now, sir. He shook his head gently. I already took a bath today, he replied, his words like finality of a judge delivering his ultimate judgment. Rani had remembered him getting generals, ministers, and foreign dignitaries shake with fear. But now here he was, a dead man walking who no longer bothered to wash himself. The refusal wasn't over the bath. It was not letting them stage the drama they wished. Like to shave? The guard asked. This he accepted. A single small mirror faced him. He guided the blade across his skin with steady fingers. The sound it made could only be described as a delicate scrape, almost ceremonial in nature. He lay down, looking at the ceiling. Just before dawn, he heard the footsteps outside his cell. He did not move, pretending to be sleeping. The cell door opened. With his voice low, Colonel Rafiuddin, the jailer, walked in, moving a step closer. "Sir, is there anything you would like before we take you away?" Bhutto gazed into his eyes. "I have done what must be done," he said quietly. "Nothing more to say. Words will be for the living now, and the living have to bear them in the pages of history." The deputy superintendent stood behind the jailer. "Sir, the gallows are far away, the stretcher is ready," he addressed the jailer. Bhutto did not move. They waited. It finally took 4 people to put him on the stretcher. He was lighter, just the weight of his defiance and breath. "Goodbye, Mr. Prime Minister," the jailer murmured. "May your last morning be better than your existing life." And there, at that moment in her room, Rani crept several paces, soft steps silenced by the quiet of their movement. She knew why the condemned all stare straight ahead, just like running a mirror maze. If you turn around, then it's over. Bhutto would not be an exception, she thought. At the prison, wall lamps formed little ponds of amber, one for every sorrow. In the distance somewhere, high above but still far off, loomed the gallows, and below them one could hear in the crackling wind something like a low tide of holy recitation. They set him down. He got up and walked the last few steps to the gallows, almost as if he was going on a stage to address the people who loved him. The face was covered with a hood, hands tied behind his back. "It hurts, loosen them," he asked the hangman, Tara Massey. He stayed quiet. The hangman knotted a cord around his feet, rope around his neck. The lever fell. The very first light that drowned the Rawalpindi sky unveiled a coffin when it was being carried to the yard. No guard of honor, no flag. She lay on the bed staring at the wall, with a peculiar hollow feel of that little ache one feels when a man who believed himself to be building a nation had only become its trivia. For her, the night was over. For Bhutto, the day had dawned into total darkness. His story had come to an end. She picked up the phone, dialed Yahya's no. He picked up the phone after few rings with his frail hands. "It's over Aga Jani," she said in a broken voice. She dropped the line, knowing that it was the last time she was hearing his voice before he will end up in the stained pages of history. The news sifts through the cracked window. General Zia killed in an army plane crash, all on board gutted by flames. The bed groans below her, bones grating as she turns, the weight of her failing body stifled by shifting fabric. Zia-ul-Haq, the man who caged a country, had finally died, and she snorts with disdain, thinking that the dictator finally got his due. Her eyes, fogged with years, looking at the ceiling fissures that weave a labyrinth of breaks akin to Pakistan. She remembers him, that officer with the mustache slanting over a devious smile. That was Zia who clambered to power on the treacherous rungs of a coup. She crushes the morning paper. Her thick fingers strangle the sheet. Rumors rolled in like smoke, boxes of TNT hidden in mango crates, cockpit nerve gas, a missile from behind, an invisible hand. Whatever it was God's divine retribution. Zia had made a mess of Pakistan in the name of salvation. Salvation for whom? He cloaked the land with an Islamic version, but it was a thin veneer over tyranny, a theocracy of terror. When the bearded arbiters, the ulama, came to power by his will, they destroyed the country's future forever. While he curled his mustache and smiled, promised order he never could afford to create, a blend of poison that dripped in honey from his mouth. The room cools off, or maybe the rush of blood in her pauses, pools in veins already too exhausted to remember further. Her eyes drifted to the window. The light that spilled into the dark room is sickly pale, a soft, dawning autumn full of endings and also beginnings. Zia has died creating a space to breathe. She wonders if this is the moment where democracy will be able to lift its face up from the grave that Zia has dug for it in the name of Islam. The country still continues to bleed, and its democracy remains a facade, with his memory being the ghost that imprisons its soul. The mullahs he empowered, the generals he enriched, the jihadis he armed will not fade gently, she knew. She closes her eyes, takes the smallest breath in, wondering whether the sky wept when he fell from the sky, burned prior to being burned again in hell. As the fire took him, she thinks, did he see the faces of those he silenced, of innocents cut down in their dreams? She smiles, a slight upturn of her lips as she whispers to the shadows, he deserved a more painful end. The room grows quiet, her breath a whisper, and in that silence she dreams of a country untied, its scars stitched, or she was just hallucinating about an illusion. She shuts her eyes again, in her faint heart beats, dreaming silently, sowing hope into every wound he had inflicted. Her own wounds were temporary till her body meets the dust. The ones inflicted upon the destiny of this unfortunate country were permanent. It was a cold morning when the sunrise pushed its way through louvered blinds and treated those time-worn walls into a pale, guilty light. She was combing her thin, intractable hair, all that now remained, when the fingers discovered from behind what seemed to be a little hard knot, no bigger than an acorn, deep-seated within the tissue. She did not move for a while. The brush fell from her hand and hit the floor, a soft thudding noise as it impacted against the carpet. She wasn't afraid, not in the slightest. There was only a grim uncertainty. She, who had survived coups and conspiracies, whose feet have trampled the empires of men around her for centuries, she has finally found one enemy she cannot outmaneuver. At first, she kept her discovery to herself as so many truths had been locked away behind that composed smile. But the disease was relentless, a creeping blight that spread to her body, until even basic movement became an agony. She had to fight her last battle against cancer, having much lesser toxic than the humans she came across. There were a team of doctors, cramped in her room, their voices clinical and cautious, as if the magnitude of her destiny might flatten them out too. Every morning she would sit alone with her pain and remembrances of the past. She recalled the wind on Murray's Mall Road, when she threw her veil into dust and turned herself into that which no man could ever command. She thought of her and Yahya's laughter, how it had lifted the early chill over her loneliness. She thought of Bhutto, ambitious, brilliant, and dangerous. Years ago, in her jeweled hands, she had cradled their future. She had erected her empire from the weaknesses of men, and she remembered their fall, and now she was grappling with the last empire, her own mortality. The house grew quieter as weeks passed. Visitors were few. The children, grown and scattered into their own lives, they felt more like an absence than a presence. They did not know where the most pain lay, not in her bones. It was in her memory. She wanted to be alone each night. When the door clicked shut, she would fumble for a small wooden box on her bedside table. In these were the remnants of her rule, old letters, press reports, a yellowing photograph of her and Yahya smiling as if in conspiracy. She would stroke them with her fingers, as if the past might still keep her warm. On one of those nights when the pain was a wild creature that could not be driven back into its cave, she had closed her eyes and spoken to it as if life were listening. I am Rani, eyes collecting tears but not ever allowing them to fall. The queen who knew the secrets of generals and politicians, whose words could make or break. I changed the destiny of a nation. Her voice started breaking. Power does not love you. It does not miss you when you're gone. She gazed up at the ceiling, at part of a hairline crack reaching across that split it in two, as if even her room could not carry the weight of things she had still to remember. Silence followed as she waited for an answer from invisible. There was none. Only the ticking of that clock, a soft rattle as she breathed, words blurred in her head. Hours passed in a whisper of memory and remorse. She was drifting further and further away from the life she had woven. Then a light shone. In that dying glow, she felt all her burdens falling away. In those dying moments, the thought was not of men she had loved or enemies she outwitted. It was of the girl who had not been able to stand straight in a summer wind because her veil kept blowing onto the ground. The space in time when her life really started, one small tear escaped from the corner of her eye. And when the final breath did come, it was soft, so quiet. She dissipated into the darkness with her legacy and her secrets outliving her existence. Years have gone by, her name disappeared from the headlines, and yet her invisible presence remains. The young officers who had once conspired against her had become prominent figures, but none could compete with her finesse in the labyrinth of politics and authority. Till date, she lives on as someone mysterious and revered. She had played the game of power longer than anyone, and while she was no longer in at the heart of it all anymore, her legacy lives on. Those who came after also know that she had been the architect of many chapters in Pakistan's history, and her name will always be uttered with reverence mingled with sadness. In the end, she had not pursued power as an end in itself, but rather to survive. And she had outlasted all of her enemies. And so the queen remained, after all of other players went into oblivion. First edition, 2025 publisher. Amazon, Kindle copyright 2025, all rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, stored in a retrieval system, or transmitted in any form or by any means electronic, mechanical, photocopying, recording, or otherwise without the prior written permission of the publisher, except in the case of brief quotations embodied in critical articles or reviews. This is a work of historical fiction. Characters, places, and incidents are the product of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons' names, living or dead, events, or locales are entirely coincidental.